When I posted my previous video about which foreign tank the Red Army liked best, second to the Sherman, of course, many of you guessed that this tank would have been the Churchill, and that makes sense. It was the heaviest tank that came from abroad. Aside from the Pershing, heaviest tank that was actually used in combat. It was the most thickly armored. Its gun was, in terms of armor penetration, the most powerful. And yet, if you saw my other Lend-Lease video, you'd see that despite the tank being rated quite highly at the B tier, just a hair over 250 tanks were received, compared to the Matilda, which was rated lower, but actually more tanks were sent. How come? What kind of paradox is this? Why did this happen? And why does the Churchill not get the kind of recognition that it arguably deserves in the ranks of the Red Army? Well, watch this video and find out. But first, let's go through the history of the Churchill tank quickly and see how it got to the USSR and why. The story of the Churchill tank has a bit of a difficult beginning. It was a descendant of the A-20 tank, which was designed as a replacement for the Matilda. However, the A-20 E1 and E2 prototypes turned out to be, well, kind of subpar. In part, it turned out that the Meadows engine that powered them was very much insufficient for the amount of weight that the vehicle needed to carry. And so another engine had to be found. This was the Bedford Twin 6. This was a 12-cylinder engine, or rather, two 6-cylinder engines bolted together, and it produced 350 horsepower, which for the time, even for a heavy tank, was really not that bad, especially if this was a tank that didn't need to go all that fast. In fact, the engine was so good that Vauxhall, which was Bedford's parent company, received the contract for a whole new tank. This tank received the designation A22. The overall concept of the A-20 heavy infantry tank was preserved, but overall the general staff requirements were quite loose. They wanted a tank with a turret that could fit 3 men, so gunner, loader, and commander. They wanted a top speed of at least 16 miles per hour, and most importantly, they wanted this tank to be finished by 1941. The reason for this rush was that the British just got a bloody nose in France, retreating at the cost of losing pretty much all other tank forces on the continent, and the German invasion of the home islands was a very serious threat, and so any tank that would be built had to be built quickly because it would very likely have to be on the front lines very, very shortly. The general staff fully understood that due to the rush, reliability had to be sacrificed, and in their mind, a tank that could drive for as little as 50 miles would still be fine, as long as it could drive to the battlefield, blow up some German tanks, and, well, it can break down at that point. It's done its job. One might think that giving this project to Vauxhall would be a terrible idea, since Vauxhall they don't really have any experience in building tanks. But if you think about it a little bit more, it actually wasn't that bad of a choice. Not a single company in the UK actually had experience of building a 40-ton tank, and Vauxhall had already experience building heavy machinery, and, well, the Bedford engine was quite good, so might as well let them have a shot at it and see what comes out. The resulting tank was a very interesting design. The turret had a 2-pounder gun, just like the Matilda and the Valentine, but there was a 3-inch howitzer in the hull. This was a gun that was used on British close support tanks, and by mounting it on the A-22, you actually had a regular tank and a close support tank all in one, which made it quite versatile. Unlike the French Char B1 with a similar solution, a 75mm howitzer in the hull, you could actually aim this gun side to side without having to turn the whole tank, so that made it a little bit more useful. And unlike the M3 Lee, which had also a 75mm gun in the hull, the gun was not serviced by 2 crewmen, but rather just by 1. This made it, of course, a little bit more difficult to use, but also allowed the size of the tank to be kept down and, well, was much, much smaller than the Lee tank. The resulting tank was called Infantry Tank Mark IV. Now, there was a addition to the design, or rather a subtraction from the design, made very quickly. The howitzer in the hull was replaced by a standard Bessa machine gun. This was much easier for a single man to operate, as you didn't have to reload it, at least not with every shot. And this tank received the designation Infantry Tank Mark IV A. Soon after, these tanks are renamed to Churchill 1 and Churchill 2, respectively. A prototype of this tank was inspected by Brigadier General Worthington, who is credited as the father of the Canadian Armored Corps. He had a very, very high opinion of this tank. He thought that its powerful armament, varied armament as well, powerful engine, and thick armor would actually make it a universal tank. It could go fast enough to replace cruiser tanks, it had enough armor to replace infantry tanks, and having both a high velocity cannon and a howitzer, it could be its own close support tank. So if everything went well, in theory, the whole British tank forces and the whole Canadian tank forces would be using the infantry tank Mark IV. Worthington had high expectations for this tank, but the results were maybe not so rosy. As predicted by the general staff, the rush to develop this tank did result in quite poor reliability. The initial lifespan of the tracks was just 20 miles, and in October of 1941, the manufacturers finally reached the mark that the general staff wanted of 50 miles before the tracks had to be replaced. This was still better than the engine, which as of July 1941 could only put out 9 hours of runtime, so it didn't even make it to double digits. Despite being promising initially, the engine performed quite badly. Sir Harry Ricardo, the inventor of the famous Ricardo tank engine of the First World War, actually suggested that in order to receive satisfactory performance, the power output should be reduced from 350 horsepower to 300. But then, considering that the cooling system and other accessories pulled off another 50 horsepower before the power actually got to the engine, this would pretty much nullify the advantage of the Bedford Twin 6 over the Meadows engine, and so this modification was never done. Ricardo also recommended removing another troublesome part of the design, the suspension, and just having the tank drive around on rigid wheels, like the heavy tanks of the First World War. The poor state of this tank was actually not a secret, and Churchill himself joked. As might be expected, it had many defects and teething troubles, and when these became apparent, the tank was appropriately rechristened the Churchill. There were some in the House of Commons who called for the Churchill to be cancelled entirely, but the Churchill had one significant advantage over every other competitor. It was actually finished. There were competing heavy tank ideas, including the TOG, but they were still on the drawing board and would still need a lot of work to actually get out there. Meanwhile, the Churchill existed. You could go out and touch one, and even if it didn't work very well, there was still a foundation to iterate upon. The situation began to improve somewhat by December of 1941. 20 of 22 critical defects that were identified over the summer had actually been repaired, and a remanufacturing program was introduced starting in March of 1942 that would remediate these defects in tanks that were already produced. The first 300 tanks that were built were considered to be beyond repair, but they could still be retained domestically and used for training. Now, ironically, the invasion that the Churchill tank was supposed to repel didn't happen. By the end of 1941, it was clear that the Germans were now stuck in the USSR. Operation Barbarossa didn't achieve its goals, and, well, the Germans had maybe a little bit too much on their plate to worry about an amphibious invasion of the UK. The Churchill tank could now be sent to the east in order to fight the Germans there, and since Moscow still stood, and in fact, the front line was rolling back to the west. The British could be confident that sending their tanks abroad wouldn't just put them in German hands for free. So while the British were happy to send Matilda, Valentine, and Tetrarch tanks, they were a little bit more reluctant to do so with the Churchill. One of the reasons was that the remanufacturing program hadn't started yet, and all of the tanks that they would have been able to send were quite fragile mechanically. Interestingly enough, some theorized that the underperforming cooling system would not really be an issue in the USSR since there was a pretty harsh winter in effect, and others claimed that Russians, as good mechanics, would be able to keep them in working order. However, even though there was discussion about sending tanks to the USSR as early as November of 1941, this was not actually done. To make sure that Churchill tanks would work in the USSR at all, the British sent them to the second coldest place they could think of, Canada. A Canadian officer and 4 tank crewmen were dispatched from Britain back to Canada. They were accompanied by a document listing the known defects of the Churchill tank, which spanned a total of 11 pages. The Canadians estimated that the lifespan of a Churchill tank before it needed an overhaul was 500 miles. This was, of course, better than the 50 miles that the General Staff wanted to begin with, but still not really that much, particularly if you have to use these tanks to train drivers. Since the two tanks were sent to Canada for cold weather trials, the British wanted to test them at a temperature of minus 40 degrees Celsius, but it never got that cold during the winter, so the British had to settle for a slightly higher temperature of minus 34 degrees. Nevertheless, the tanks did actually work in that weather. The Canadians concluded that, armed with the 11-page list of known defects and their observations about how to mix lubricants that would work in severe cold, the Soviets would figure out how to use these tanks in combat. Shipments of Churchill tanks to the USSR began in May 1942. British records show that 32 Churchill 2 tanks were sent between May and June of 1942, but due to losses in shipping, only 20 Churchill 2 tanks ever arrived in the USSR. The vast majority of deliveries were made up by Churchill 3 and Churchill 4 tanks with 6-pounder guns rather than 2-pounders. Soviet testing showed that these tanks were still riddled with defects despite the remanufacturing program. Most of the tanks had issues with the recoil brake. There were common cases of cracks in the crankcases, and the tank that was sent to Kubinka for trials actually suffered from a cracked engine block and could not actually be used in said trials. It was difficult to repair these tanks since spare parts were still very much uncommon, and actually a separate tank had to be allocated for trials with a note saying that, don't use it very much. We still need to send it to the front lines to fight. So the trials were very much abbreviated. Trials showed that aside from the reliability issues, the Churchill tank was actually quite good. The armor was thick, the gun was powerful enough to punch even the Tiger's armor. Vision from the turret, the hull was a different story, but vision from the turret was really good. In particular, the Mark IV periscope earned top marks from the Red Army, and it was even copied under the name MK4. MK4 in this case stands for Infantry Tank Mark IV, which was the Churchill's designation. This was a periscope used pretty much on all Soviet tanks in the second half of the war. The mobility of the tank was not that great. This was still a slow-moving infantry tank, but the average speed of the Churchill off-road was not that much lower than the KD-1's average speed, so in many cases you could use them side by side. The Churchill tank still had some issues going up steep inclines, but nevertheless, its mobility was adequate for a heavy tank. Thanks to a limited supply of these tanks and the aforementioned defects, formation of Churchill regiments only began in October of 1942. As I mentioned before, these were all Guards heavy tank regiments, so the Churchill was considered to be a proper full-blooded heavy tank on par with the KB-1 and the KB-1S. The tanks that were being issued to the regiments still had mechanical problems, which they were left on their own devices to figure out how to deal with. And so, as a result, the first Churchill tanks to see battle on the Eastern Front did so in January of 1943 in the closing phases of the Battle of Stalingrad. The 48th Guards Heavy Tank Regiment that used them here reported that the firepower was sufficient, but poor reliability and mechanical defects still reduced the number of tanks that could actually be sent to fight. The 47th Heavy Tank Regiment fighting nearby reported the same thing, and the experience of the 49th and 50th Regiments fighting north in Leningrad was pretty much on par with the rest of them. Powerful tank, but very unreliable, lots of mechanical problems, and also poor performance on snow and ice. There were a lot of different competing designs on welding cleats to the tracks in order to give them better traction, which mostly worked, but they were generally very short-lived because the cleats would fall off when hitting obstacles. The second major chapter of service on the Eastern Front was the Battle of Kursk, and here the experience was pretty much the same as before. Churchill tanks of the 36th Heavy Tank Regiment, as a part of the 18th Tank Corps, broke through German lines. They did the job that an infantry tank was supposed to do, but they very quickly fell behind as the Corps continued to penetrate the German territory and did so at a quite high marching speed. Unfortunately, even by mid-1943, the reliability of this tank left very much to be desired. Even though the 36th Guards was heavily battered at Kursk, there were enough survivors for the unit to stick together. It was actually refilled with newly arriving Churchill tanks and sent up north to join the 67th Army in the breakthrough of their Leningrad blockade. The Churchill tanks came too late to actually break through the blockade, but there was still lots to do. Liberation of Luga, Novgorod, and Pskov was supposed to be achieved in the same operation, and the Churchills could still make it in time for that. Unfortunately, again, due to mechanical reliability issues and the rapidly advancing front line, the Churchills were just not making it to the front line. Over the course of all of February and some of March, even, they were pretty reliably about 40 kilometers behind the front lines. Tanks were just moving too slowly, breaking down, falling behind, and the Churchills couldn't actually get to the fight until the advance stopped at German fortifications near Pskov. Once the Churchills actually got to the front lines, it turned out that, well, the armor that was satisfactory in 1942 was not really as satisfactory by the spring of 1944. The Germans already had quite a large number of powerful anti-tank guns that could penetrate the Churchill's front armor, and the gun itself was not really something that you could use to combat enemy fortifications. The 36 Guards transitioned to Su-152 SPGs and eventually swapped over to using IS-2 heavy tanks. This was pretty much the case for every single regiment that used the Churchill. It wasn't even that the armor was thin or that the gun wasn't powerful. The Red Army was still gladly using Valentine tanks that had the same gun and thinner armor, but that the reliability of the Churchill tank was just not good enough for it to keep up with the deep and rapid offensives that characterized late 1943 and 1944. Another factor that sets it apart from the Valentine tank was supply issues. Due to interruptions in Arctic convoys, the Red Army actually only received 8 Churchill tanks between February and November of 1943. Even though supplies became available after that. If you look at the situation on the front lines and the fact that the Churchill tank really was unsuitable for the kind of warfare the Red Army started to fight, there wasn't really much sense in creating new Churchill tank units. Churchills were used to refill regiments that already used Churchill tanks, and after all of those were destroyed, they would gradually swap over to IS-2 or other heavy vehicles. In conclusion, the Churchill tank was very much a product of its time. The General Staff really rushed development in order to get a tank that could defend the British Isles from a German invasion in 1941. The design choices and sacrifices made to achieve that were really incompatible with the kind of warfare that the Red Army was waging in 1943 and onwards. Would the Red Army have had better results with Churchill 7 or other more advanced variants of the Churchill? Maybe, but if in 1942 the Churchill 3 was more or less equivalent to the KV-1 and KV-1S tanks in armor and firepower, by 1944 the Churchill 7 was very much inferior to the IS-2 that was available to Red Army heavy tank units in every respect. There were 2 Churchill 7 Crocodile tanks that were sent to the USSR for trials, but the Red Army was only interested in the flamethrower. They never entertained the idea of actually using this tank in battle. These tanks were only available in limited numbers and could equip only a handful of heavy tank regiments, and so as a result, they didn't really achieve any kind of major accomplishment on the front lines that could really cement the Churchill's name in the Soviet tank history.